owners and operators of golf courses, it's their land. They're not going to ruin their own asset. They're not going to do that. They're going to be good stewards of their land and water and air as much as possible for certain, right? Just like your own house or whatever, you're going to try to keep it in order. So this narrative that might have been around for a long time about, oh, golf is just a polluter or whatever, that might have been the case 50 or 60 years ago before the environmental movement took form and the consciousness was, got up, and got better. But now I think, superintendents are scientists.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Fiella, and welcome to the Golf Sustainability Podcast for what I'm certain is going to be a very special conversation with Jay Caron, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Golf Course Owners Association. This whole topic of sustainability for owners is a critical one, and I'm interested in tackling it from a number of different angles with Jay today on our call. So, Jay, thanks very much for joining me on the Golf Sustainability Podcast.
Well, John, I appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to see there's such a singular topic podcast on sustainability out there in this space. So thank you for what you do, and I look forward to a good conversation.
Thanks very much. It's kind of funny because it's when you talk about that positioning as the first, it's kind of deja vu for me. In 2008, I had a media business for large retailers about sustainability, and we were the first one there. And then for corporates, we did some really interesting work with smart energy decisions, and we were the first focused energy resource for large corporations. And we're now hitting the golf industry, so it's an exciting time, and I appreciate your recognition of that fact.
Sure.
But listen, this isn't about me and Golf Sustainability Podcast. It's about you and your members. So let's start by having you tell us a little about your career journey, Jay, and your current role as CEO at NGCOA.
Sure. Oh, thanks, John. So I'll make a long story short. Everybody's got an interesting journey in their own lives. Mine, I happen to have been playing golf for the last 40 years, really since I was about 10 years old. So that's just kind of a lucky happenstance thing. But in 1997, I was 1 year out of college and I moved to Charleston, South Carolina to get my master's in history with the intent of being a high school teacher. That was going to be my career. Coaching cross country in the fall and golf in the spring. I thought this was going to be a pretty idyllic little life. And then I needed a little extra cash while I was in grad school. And so I through a friend, I found out about this thing called the NGCOA. No idea that even associations were a thing. And I got lucky and I got a little part-time job here in August of 97 as the assistant to the event planner and who ended up becoming my mother-in-law. So there's a whole other journey here. But I loved it so much. John, I was in college and high school, I was leaders of clubs and student government and all that kind of stuff. And so I really had already cut my teeth on a lot of, small leadership things and, organizing people and towards a common goal or whatever. And so when I really dove into this association thing and I quickly made it a career, I kind of fell in love. So I'm just lucky that it's in golf. But really association management has become my profession in my career. And I stayed at NGCOA for 10 years until 2007. And then I left and became the CEO of the National Association really for the bed and breakfast industry from 2007 up until about 2013 or so. And then I in the same lodging industry, I was CEO of a group of about 300 kind of high quality inns around America called Select Registry. So I ran that for a couple of years before getting recruited back a little bit to NGCOA in 2015. So I've been the CEO of NGCOA since October 2015, and it's been a good ride. So I've seen the golf industry in the good times and the bad times and the even better times now. So yeah, that's a little bit about my journey.
That's interesting. So some would refer to you as a boomerang. You were at NGCOA, you left, and then you came back. That time away from the association, I'm sure, was very, very helpful in terms of broadening your perspective on kind of practices and what you could do to help the association.
It was because at the time I left NGCOA in the golf industry right when the black cloud started kind of forming over the industry from an economic standpoint. Supply and demand was getting out of balance, and the economy was about to tank, although we didn't know it at the time. The recession, the Great Recession that happened. And I go into the lodging industry during the Great Recession. So that, we had our bruises there too. But this is at a time when a lot of these online companies started getting to be known, were born, like Yelp and Airbnb and TripAdvisor. And so I was fighting for property owners for correct treatment on these sites, because it was a little bit of the Wild West. So I cut my teeth on a lot of advocacy work in the marketplace for fair treatment, good policies with these online sites, which I brought to the golf industry, or brought back to the golf industry, as we continued to deal with kind of similar dragons in the golf industry with online tee time agencies and so forth. And so I learned a great deal in the lodging industry for almost 9 years that I was able to bring back to golf.
Oh,
for sure.
That's super. So many people may not know the details around NGCOA and its membership. Tell us about the different segments of your membership at NGCOA.
Sure. You were at our golf business conference recently, so you got a little bit of a taste of who we represent. But the association was born in the 1970s. There was a kind of a small committee or task force of men and women who owned public golf courses. Now, back then in the 1970s, John, that was not the predominant supply in the when you look at the supply of golf courses in the 20th century. It was really private clubs and municipals were really the primary supplies. And then the advent of what we call daily fee golf, where if you and your family turned your farm into a golf course, like those kinds of examples, and then fast forward into the 80s and 90s, and all these housing developments that popped up with golf as a centerpiece in the suburbs, all of these things, we represented the interests of the privately owned public golf course first and foremost. That's kind of who was the genesis of NGCOA back then. And so that's been our kind of the nucleus of who we represent. But really, we look towards the ownership first, because it's the owner that signs, the front of checks, not the back of checks, and that's different decision making and different role in the industry versus a lot of the other associations. And so we look to the owners first and what's on their minds, and what's, we care about the business more than we care about a profession necessarily, although we care about all of the above. When you look at who we represent, like I said, the smaller privately owned facility is still kind of the heart of NGCOA, but we have everything imaginable, from Pebble Beach resorts to, Pinehurst. We have over 600 clubs, private clubs in the organization as well, because we do a lot of advocacy work, a lot of public policy, government affairs work. So they join to support our work there, because, a lot of these public policy issues are indiscriminate. Doesn't matter if you're a private club or high-end resort or a little family farm golf course. And so, when you look at our membership, we have almost 4,000 courses in the organization, and it almost mirrors what's out there in the industry, John. Mostly public golf courses, but a lot of munis, a lot of private clubs, and everything in between.
Interesting. So 4,000 courses. So that's, I guess, the total universe of courses is about 15,000. So it's just under a third of the total universe. It's fascinating to see what's happening in the industry. I mean, and I guess it all started with Bandon Dunes, but that destination high-end resort segment of the industry is seems to be very, very active. But on the other end of the spectrum, I mean, I think municipal golf is an area that deserves a lot of attention, and I'm glad to hear that some of the munis are members of NGCOA.
It's a growing segment in our membership too. It's actually a focus of ours.
I was really kind of surprised to see that there isn't a dedicated group for municipal courses. That's a segment that you may want to have increase participation in. So the way we think about sustainability at Golf Sustainability is that there are really kind of two dimensions that lead to a third dimension, and that third dimension being the most important to your members. There's environmental sustainability, which involves the kind of supply side of the equation. There's the social sustainability that involves increasing demand for use of the course. That's kind of the revenue piece. And if you do the environmental side right and reduce your expenses, and do the social side right and increase your revenues, that's going to lead to that third dimension, which is greater economic sustainability. How does NGCOA look at or think about the topic of sustainability?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we look at it first and foremost through the lens of economic sustainability first, right? And then anything outside of that is kind of goodwill and for the greater good and to do the right things and what have you. Because without economic sustainability, you have no golf course. You can have a golf course without some of the other sustainability things happening in full gear. Doesn't mean it's the best practices, but if you can't pay the bills, then and the course shuts down, then there is no environmental or social sustainability to even talk about at a golf course, right? And so economics has to make sense and it has to work. But like you said, they're independent, and they're interdependent, independent and interdependent. But on the environmental side, what we do at NGCOA these days, because I think it's ebbed and flowed over the years, our involvement in the environmental space, because I feel like my first stint in NGCOA that I mentioned, at the beginning of the interview, John, I felt like there were more environmental efforts going on in the golf industry in general. Like there was conferences on golf and the environment, and just more emphasis on it. I don't know if it was a late 90s, early millennium, just trending thing overall, but it kind of caught fire a little bit, the environmental sustainability movement in businesses and sectors, and we were part of that. And then I think over time things fell in different lanes. For example, like the GCSAA, what they do, Golf Course Superintendents Association. We are very close with that organization. We help them on a lot of things, and we work together to address environmental issues. Oftentimes we look at environmental issues in golf as what's reasonable and what's good. We have to, it's an interesting tightrope to walk, John, on the environmental side, because on one side you have government agencies and regulators that'll come in and say, you can't do this, or this is bad. Or even local citizens who aren't necessarily the most informed, trying to get their city councils to ban certain substances or what have you when the EPA says it's okay. So we have to kind of fight these little fights for reasonable business practices that are also good and not damaging, right? So while we are proponents of healthy environmental practices, we also have to be watchdogs for overreach and what might be too much that puts economic burdens on golf courses to try to be environmentally friendly. So, but we do a lot in sharing stories. I call it food for thought. We share stories of good environmental practices and good content, whether it's our conferences or our golf business magazine or what have you. So that's kind of, it's a little bit of a hodgepodge these days. On the social side, this is where there seems to be, kind of catching fire. The environmental one caught fire, let's say 25 years ago. Now look at the social sustainability side in golf. And it really, there's been activities for a long time, John, but it didn't catch fire, if you will, until the summer of 2020 and the unfortunate tragedy around George Floyd. And it just kind of brought into relief, what is anybody doing on this regard, right? Not just golf. And the good news is we had been doing a lot of work, but what it caused at that moment in time was a stepping up of investment and attention to this, right? Whether you call it DEI or whatever it is, like what are we doing to make golf accessible, diverse, and all of these things? And NGCOA, long time ago, 25, 26 years ago, we saw the writing on the wall. It was more economic, but we saw the social aspect to this, where 25 years ago, we were the first organization to see that the supply and demand curve was going to be out of balance. It was going to be backwards, and it was coming. And it's just the courses were coming out of the ground way too fast for the demand that was happening. So we started a program called Get Linked Play Golf. This was around 1999. And it was, if you saw the advertisements that we had, this was a grassroots ad campaign. It was, the pictures and the ads were about diversity and getting more people of all stripes in the game of golf. And one of my favorite ads was this, a picture of a woman. She had just teed off, and behind her were these three guys, assuming that they were filled out the foursome, and they were like looking like this, like, oh my God, that was an amazing drive. And the ad copy said, Get Linked Play Golf. It said, that's the sound of the glass ceiling breaking. Get Linked Play Golf, right? And it was like, so we had kind of our finger on the pulse of the need for diversity in the game as we were launching this. And since then, it's evolved into so many things with so many organizations trying their hand at diversifying the game and now the workforce. And a lot of that falls under Make Golf Your Thing now. We also have Make Golf Your Career as a part of that, because we know it's not just who's playing the game, but who's working in our workforce. The 15,000 golf courses, that if there's diversity in the workforce, not only is that good for the workforce, but it's also good for the optics of the game. That I'm stepping into a place that values diversity, so that's good. Also, in the fall of 2022, we hosted an event called Lead Golf Together, and it was about trying to have conversations and action around changing the diversity in C-suites and boardrooms around the golf industry, because it was identified that golf's leaders, C-suites and boardrooms, were 97% male and white. Well, what can we do about that? Let's at least have some conversation around it, put the mirror up and take a look at ourselves, and what can we do to change that? And so that's kind of been our contribution a little bit to that conversation. As well, NGCOA has a seat on the board of the National Alliance for Accessible Golf to make sure that the doors are open and welcoming to those with disabilities. And golf is a very popular activity, as whether it's therapeutic or simply just, for people living a good life, is if they have disabilities, and there are so many different kinds, that what can we do to support the National Alliance for Accessible Golf, and getting the word out there that golf is welcome. But also on the other side, this is the tightrope that I mentioned, is that you'll have folks suing golf courses because in their minds, they're not accessible enough, under ADA or whatever it might be. So we kind of have to be the arbiter a little bit here of what's reasonable and what's not, and with regard to putting demands on a business to accommodate different kinds of disabilities. Does a single rider golf car, is that the cure-all, for any disability? Should every golf course have them across the land? Should they be forced to have them? Or should it be a voluntary thing and a good thing that we promote? And these are the kinds of discussions that are kind of difficult, but we're certainly happy to be at the table and involved in advancing the cause.
Yeah. Well, you just covered a lot to unpack there, my friend. Yeah. And, it's interesting because in thinking about this, I mean, you're not only responsible for, or you don't only have an interest in helping to advance practices that will be a benefit to your members, but you also you're responsible for protecting against this overreach issue. And I would imagine your members who are based in California, right, or in Arizona, have incredible issues to address. Because I know from my experience in corporate sustainability, it's kind of these regulatory issues and demands and requirements. They kind of start in Europe. They go from Europe to California. And then once they're embedded in California, they kind of percolate from there. But the pressures that your members must face in California, I'm sure, are substantial in their own right. And this, this thinking about sustainability from the economic point of view first, I think is super important. And there's generally in the first stage, I talk to folks about kind of the 3 stages of enlightenment as it relates to sustainability. And kind of phase 1 is where there's concern that being sustainable is going to hurt me economically, so we avoid it. But then if people embrace it successfully and it reduces their costs and actually improves their profitability, say, hey, maybe this could be good for us. And then once people are well down the road, they become advocates and try to get others on board. So this issue of economic sustainability as being the principal area of focus is something I'd like to get into in a little more detail later on in the conversation. So thanks for sharing that broad array of thoughts. Are there do you see any distinctions in your membership in terms of how they think about it based on their profile or their size? Like, do the large multi-course operators view it separately from indies or from municipalities? I don't think there are many public companies that own golf courses. I could be wrong. I mean, is that a piece of the multi-course arena?
Yeah. So a good question overall. I think on the publicly traded kind of companies, you might have some like Marriott that has a portfolio of golf courses that they have with their properties or what have you, but not outright large multi-course owners that are publicly traded necessarily. So, I do see some distinctions between different kinds of members and what they bring to the table and what they do. And these are broad strokes, but I think there's probably some correlations here. One, I would think, those that are more resourceful, that have more resources, that might be operating on a $6 to $10 million budget instead of a $1 million budget, just might have more tools that they can pull out to do things with, right? So I think there's a correlation there. So if environmentally friendly practices cost money, or there's some that cost a lot, that might not have an ROI that you can point to, like this is going to bring me business. I think the more resources you have, the more likely you are to kind of do something good because you have more resources, just period, right? I think the more high profile you are as a company, the more likely you are to participate because there is kind of this, I'd say, marketplace is watching you, right? Whether it's some of the large multi-course owners like a Troon Golf or invited clubs, from the MCO side, or just really high end resorts, whether it's Pinehurst or Pebble or Bandon or what have you. If they're ignoring environmental sustainability, it's probably at their own PR peril, right? I'm sure the more high profile you are, the more likely you're going to be tuned in. And if it's because of that high profile pressure, maybe that's okay. It's like there are certain levers that are or things that are in the marketplace that probably drive these behaviors, right? And if it's a high profile, you're more likely to have environmentalists say, what's going on over there? Because I read about this course in the New York Times or whatever. So I think, there's a correlation between level of profile and participation. I would imagine, private clubs are probably, there are probably a lot of private clubs that are doing things than public golf courses. There might be a correlation here because they're subject to group dynamics more than if you and your family own a golf course, John, who are you subject to? Yourselves. You own it. You can do whatever you want, right? When you're a private club and you've got membership committees and a group of people, if there are some people there that are, environmentally conscious and they say, hey, general manager or hey, board president, what are we doing about this? What is the runoff of our water? Where is it going? And are we doing the right thing? Because there's a group dynamic of responsibility, right? That is in the DNA of a private club. So I think there's going to be a correlation between a higher level of consciousness towards that. Now, the flip side sometimes can be that the higher profile, the higher end, the higher economics, the more expectation there would be for the pristine, perfect golf course. And in the past, pristine perfection might have meant in the past, well, I'm not going to necessarily pay as much attention to the environmental sustainability question because I got to deliver the perfect golf course. And, and so I think there's less of that these days for sure. But in the past, that might have been that counterbalance to that high profile, the economically suited private clubs that have the resources, but also have that demand of the Greens Committee that says, what are we doing about these weeds over on the left side of the 14th fairway? Well, we're letting them grow. It's off. Well, I don't know. I don't like how they look. So it's a battle, right? And I'd say lastly that municipal golf course, I would imagine in many munis, there's going to be a higher sensitivity to being sustainable because it's a government-run facility in some way. And so the citizens, this group mentality, who are you responsible to is an important question in, I think, participation in these things. If you're responsible to your citizenry and you have to be on the up and up and you have to justify your existence, because if only 10% of the population in some city plays golf, you're going to have 90%, some of the 90% saying, why are we doing this? Why do we have a golf course? Why isn't this just a public park for all of us to enjoy? Well, it contributes to the economy of the city and it does all these things. If you're not doing the right thing environmentally, someone's going to use that as a reason to say, well, shut them down, or whatever. So there's an accountability question that I think is in the DNA of a lot of the participation in these things. And until the day that the consumer is the ultimate accountability factor, which I don't think it is right now, because I don't think the consumer is demanding these environmentally friendly practices across a lot of business spectrums. Like, for example, are consumers saying, I'm not going to stay in the hotel unless it's LEED certified. I'm not staying there. Like, I don't know if it's gotten to that point, where consumers are making or are boycotting places because they have not demonstrated environmental sustainability to some regard. That's a whole other conversation, certainly. But right now, I don't feel like that is the accountability driver right now as far as sustainability practice. It's up to the goodwill, the teaching, folks like you getting out there saying, this is why we should do it. And people listening saying, you're right. I think I'm going to jump into the Audubon program and check it out and be certified or whatever it might be. But I'm waiting for the consumer to be the factor that really drives change.
Well, you did it again. You've just thrown out so many things to respond to. I don't know where to start. My head's exploding here.
This might be part one of a 5-part podcast.
But in thinking about how you describe things, and that was brilliant. There's a higher level of interest from the larger companies that have the resources to try to fund good works. And then you've got the municipalities who probably have some movement, edict, or mandate because they're municipally owned, which there is, I've got specific support for that at the PGA show when I was, I attended your event. And by the way, you guys had a great session on sustainability, which I thought was really well done. That session alone made the trip worthwhile for me. So your team did a great job with that. But in talking to people in the PGA show, I was speaking to a golf cart manufacturer, and they had this signage up on sustainability. And I was like, well, what, why is sustainability important to a golf cart manufacturer? And they referenced how, and this is particularly true in the municipal segment, RFPs they're getting from municipal courses, they're starting to get asked about their sustainability initiatives. And that makes sense because from my corporate sustainability experience, I've dealt with a lot of cities. And if a city makes a sustainability commitment to be net zero or 100% renewable energy, and they make a formal commitment that then cascades through all elements of their operation, which all of a sudden is going to make it important for Parks and Rec and the golf community. So there's that pressure starting. But then the bulk of your members are these smaller, I would assume, are these not in terms of number of courses operated, but in terms of number of members. Like, I'm thinking about your membership as like a bell curve with the munis on one side, the large groups that have substantial funds on the other side, and then you've got this big bubble in the middle, which is your classic privately held, independent operator who's squeezed on costs and is particularly concerned about profitability, who may very well have the question, if I do this, how much more money will I make?
Correct. You're right. The fat of that bell curve, right? They don't have the luxury to lose money not for long. Where, municipalities, a lot of them are subsidized. They lose money, and that's okay in their economic world because they see this, we're providing a service to the town or what have you. And so they might be able to do some of these environmental things that a privately owned course may not be able to, because they can afford to be in the red in order to make that happen. So you're right. Now, that, again, these are broad strokes,
of course,
not in every case. Yep.
Okay, so what a thought that immediately comes to mind for me is in that first bucket, I mean, people have to find a way to save. The enhanced economics initially comes from cost reduction. So if you find a way to, use less water, and I know there are some of your members that may not pay for water, but if you could realize a 20% reduction in water use, which was one of the, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the presenter at the session at your meeting, but they talked about how these initiatives they implemented reduced input costs. And the benefit they got was more on cost savings rather than revenue improvement. That's really what the focus needs to be. And then it's on the supply side, on the demand side, which, I refer to it as the democratization of golf, where you're getting more people playing the game. That's really the revenue piece. So that's we will have a lot more to talk about this, and maybe we do need to, jointly do a study.
Let's address the first thing you said, like on the cost side. There's definitely been a movement led by the superintendents and the USGA and the architects. There's been a lot of conversation around the browning of golf, right? This concept that not everything has to be perfectly green. Inputs aren't needed everywhere. You don't need to water, the areas that golfers are never even walking to or whatever. So there's definitely been a movement towards this, and the GCSA certainly reports out the reduction of water use over time has been substantial, right? So, but there's a point of diminishing returns, right? And that's where we're all trying to figure out what is that. For example, let's take back to my hotel experiences in the lodging industry. If the hotel industry or the bed and breakfast industry, had a commitment to reducing water supply by 40%. Okay, what does that mean? To the consumer. Does that mean that the shower heads now are such that the water pressure and the amount of water that comes out is reduced by 40%? So the shower itself is not as of an enjoyable experience. Like, it's taken me 6 minutes longer to take a shower because the water pressure is low, the volume is low. All right, you know what? In the name of the environment, I'll do this or whatever. But there's a point at which, just like a golf course, where does the browning stop? Are you okay with not overseeding and not, going through those agronomic costs or what have you? In the name of browning, hey, golfers, get used to a totally brown facility over the wintertime. Sorry, there's a point of these diminishing returns, and economically, at least speaking. And so that's where everybody's trying to figure out where is that line and what have you. But, water is an issue. It's an existential issue in some places, where out west especially. So that's I don't call that, it's not an environmental question. It's a survival question in many cases. Will we have access to water in certain markets in the West, and for how long? So that's important. The inputs, whether it's pesticides, herbicides, nutrients, all of these things, you got to remember that underneath all this, and this gets forgotten, I think, or the narrative is, we got to make sure that the narrative is out there. Owners and operators of golf courses, it's their land. They're not going to ruin their own asset. They're not going to do that. They're going to be good stewards of their land and water and air as much as possible for certain, right? Just like your own house or whatever, you're going to try to keep it in order, try to do the right things as much as possible. So this narrative that might have been around for a long time about, golf is just a polluter or whatever, that might have been the case 50 or 60 years ago before the environmental movement took form and the consciousness was, got up, and got better. But now, I think, superintendents are scientists. They really are. They understand inputs. They're not going to damage their own facility in the name of waste. And let's just, do whatever we have to make sure that it's as perfect and pristine. So I have a lot of faith in owners and operators and superintendents as stewards of the land for sure. And I think that narrative has got to change out there if it hasn't already.
And, you're touching on something that a number of people have mentioned to me, and that is there is this issue around kind of consumer education it's needed because, for example, it's natural for some grasses to be dormant during the winter. And if you go, if you play in Europe and they take pride in the fact that their courses are hard and fast and there's not as much of a preoccupation around the complexion, whereas that, Augusta was just a couple of weeks ago, and the week after Augusta, superintendents all over the country are getting beat up about why doesn't my course look as good as Augusta? But so that's a very real issue. We've talked a lot about the environmental piece. Let's kind of shift gears and now talk about the social side, the demand side of the game. I like to use the term the democratization of access to the game. You mentioned a handicap. By the way, Dave Barton, who is the executive, who's your counterpart, I guess, at the National Association for Accessible Golf, is just a great guy. I've had him on the show, and he's doing very, very important work. But you've got physically challenged, you've got vets, you've got women, juniors, economically disadvantaged. What are some of the kind of key issues that the association's driving, and what are the key areas of interest on the part of your members on the social side of sustainability?
Sure. So it's a complicated question. It's a complicated issue. And that's something I love as an association exec, is kind of looking at what seems to be simple and, diving into the complexities of it, right? Like, oh, golf should be accessible for everybody, democratize it, right? Okay. That's a really good thing, right? But now let's get down to brass tacks. What does that mean, right? And so, like NGCOA, for years, we've recognized that we need to do better by the women, golfers out there. I mean, for 30 years, we've been putting content out there about how to make your golf course more women friendly, right? Okay, great. We worked at the PGA of America a couple of years ago to create this kind of self audit on your golf course from an accessibility standpoint or diversity standpoint, like outside and inside. Is it a welcoming facility or not? Speaking of the democratization, are your pro shop walls only lined with pictures of men and famous golfers, and that's it? No women, no people of color, whatever. It's one of those things where it's like, you know what? Maybe if I change the pictures of who I represent out here, if I have a picture of Charlie Sifford instead of just Jack Nicklaus, what does that say? To the people. So these kinds of things, we've been involved in these things for a long time, and we'll continue to beat those drums. On the physical disability side, like I mentioned National Alliance for Accessible Golf and what have you, there's complexity around that because, we are all in favor of making golf the chosen activity for those that have disabilities. But what can be done in the marketplace? We are a believer in free market more so than government regulations. And so how do we tell those stories? On the economic side, about economic accessibility, right? And that's what we're talking about for the most part. How could people afford to play the game of golf? Because if it's unaffordable, then you can be accused of, it's only a rich person's game or what have you. And it really isn't. And it has never been, as long as there's been municipal golf courses for certainly, it's never been a rich man's only game. That's the narrative. And I understand why that becomes a narrative, because the most popular places, the highest profile places, are the elite clubs and the expensive places. Those are the places that get on television. So that's how the world knows about golf. When it comes down to it economically, it's interesting because golf course owners, there's almost an expectation. What are you doing to make golf more accessible? And it's a big question. But, I wonder if the same question is often asked of let's say a restaurateur. What are you doing to combat hunger?
Right.
No, at your restaurant.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is our restaurants, and I'm saying this in a tongue-in-cheek way, John.
I got it.
Are restaurants expected to lower the prices of their food in the name of democratizing eating out? Or are grocery stores expected to make sure the prices of your food are low enough so that anybody can afford it? I mean, if you've been to the grocery store lately, or a dozen eggs might cost $7 or $8 in a lot of places or what have you, right? So there's this interesting question of accessibility, which is a good thing. How do we do this? And as long as golf courses have occupancy and availability of tee times that they can't sell, there are opportunities to make tee times available and accessible, like, in partnerships, like with the Youth on Course, where they facilitate, $5 rounds of golf, but they help subsidize that and pay the golf course owner behind the scenes to make him or her whole. There's some economics there, that are interesting. But, I think there are a lot of interesting programs out there that golf course owners and operators can participate in and do to make their golf, to make golf more economically accessible. But we're in a different supply and demand curve right now than we were just before COVID. So if demand is off the charts, which it is right now, and golf courses have the ability to raise their rates because everything is getting more expensive, wages, cost of goods sold, everything's getting more expensive. And there's a need for major capital improvements at golf courses. When you have 200 acres of land and buildings, things fall apart and you need to save money to do those things. Well, then green fees have to go up in order to cover these things, right? And they have been now for the first time at a better clip. we're kind of making up for lost ground. We were in an industry recession for 15 years where the consumer price index on everything went up, but the average green fee kind of barely creeped up over that same time, right? And so the question, I guess, for all of us to address is how do you address the economic accessibility question, which I think is one of the harder ones to address than even diversity and gender. How do you continue to make that possible when the economics of running a golf course can be really difficult? And I think it has to do with partnerships with nonprofits and those that are trying to bridge the gap more so than asking or demanding a golf course and you're too expensive, you should lower your rates in the name of growing the game of golf. That's a very difficult burden for a golf course owner to take on and say, well, okay, I'll lower my rates or keep them low for the good of everybody here. It's tough. It's a tough one because it's an industry full of independent businesses.
I really like that analogy to the restaurant industry. And I mean, it kind of a coin dropped in that you've got restaurants and types of restaurants that cater to different segments of the population. And some cater to a more budget conscious market. Some cater to a high end market. Doesn't mean the high end market has to reduce their pricing, but you will find folks in the high end of the market supporting causes that help fight hunger, right?
Bingo.
So I guess the question becomes, how does everyone kind of find their piece of that? And I'm wondering kind of where does off course now fit into this? I mean, does at a Top Golf or at these simulator places that are opening up, is there a way, and how does like First Tee tie in? So how does everyone now get together to work collaboratively on this? Here's what I see. I see a lot of independent activity that's taking place, and the real answers are going to be brought to the table through coordination. And is that a legitimate thought? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I mean, what do you think about that?
Sure. A couple things. One, I want to emphasize though that economic accessibility involves pricing, and what have you. And that's a difficult thing to tackle if you're a business owner, right? That can be done on that democratization, the word that you use, that don't cost any money or hardly anything. It's about creating a welcoming culture. That's not going to cost you six figures to do that. You just got to commit to it and make the change, and that's and what I mean by that. The change is not just saying, well, our doors are open to anyone. And so we are, but it's not about that. It's about going out and inviting those that are diverse into what we do, not just saying we're open to anybody. There's a big difference there, right? So that's one thing. The second thing, let's address your off-course golf topic. Is that yes, I think that can be one of the salves, if you will, of accessibility. Now, it doesn't scratch the itch of being outdoors and all of that stuff, but if it's about picking up a stick and learning the game of golf and having fun, then I think those places could be an enormous opening. We already know that more Americans swing a golf club in these places than they do on course. For the first, that happened a couple of years ago that eclipsed the on course experience. Just look to South Korea, where they have over 5,000 of these things called golf cafes, which are these simulator-based, businesses where there's food and beverage and fun. That's where elementary kids learn the game of golf. That's where so many people can learn the game in this fun, less embarrassing environment. Even my own wife, who's been married to a golf guy for years, up until recently, maybe even still today, still has these hangups and fears about when they go to a golf club or a golf course. How am I supposed to act? Am I going to embarrass myself? Am I going to embarrass you? What is right? What is wrong? But you step into one of these off course places and all that goes out the window. There's a giant screen, golf balls, hit them, have fun. So it's the perfect cultural environment for some of these things to happen. And our hope in our cause would be to how do we migrate them also to the outdoor experience? Because that to me is where the lifelong itch that you always want to scratch, that's where that lives. I don't know if people for the rest of their lives are going to want to say, let me hit a ball in a simulator for the rest of my life and I'm going to be happy as a clam, versus those that are outside and doing it. I think it's going to be different. But it is an opening, John, to your point, from an economic accessibility. Where can I go and play some fun golf? I definitely think there's an opening there. And to kind of address the third thing you brought up was like collective action. How do we get together? Well, when we saw in the industry 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that the supply and demand curves were going to be in the wrong place, we organized what was called Golf 2020. And that was an initiative that stuck around for many years. What do we do about getting people to play the game of golf to make sure that the supply is or the demand is as robust and as diverse as it can be? Over that time, through the collective effort, a lot of programs were developed, and they're still around today. There's a lot of commitments to developing programs, and they exist today. There's a no shortage of player development programming in the industry, whereas 30 years ago, they weren't there. Now we have it, right? So there's been a little bit of a, setting down. We don't need to collaborate so much now but we all came around the table again, like I mentioned, around 2020 when COVID was hitting. One, we had to ensure our survival because golf courses were closing down just like any other businesses. So we had to make the case to stay open, which we did. And then the George Floyd incident, which caused more collaboration around the diversity question, which still exists today. So I would argue it's happening today at Make Golf Your Thing. They have multiple task forces with all these associations at the table talking about these various social, democratization questions that you bring up. On the environmental side, I'd say I haven't seen that collaboration at the national organization level since some of these golf and environment conferences were had back 20 years ago or more. So I haven't seen that really come together in the same way that it did back then.
Yeah. Those efforts may have been premature or early, and maybe the time's right to kind of revisit that. Jay, we could go on and on here. I mean, this has been a great conversation. I love your perspective as an owner. I mean, I feel like I'm talking to a golf course operator, which is obviously a critical perspective on the equation. So thanks very much. I really want to make sure we get some time to talk about you and get our listeners a chance to know Jay Caron in a little more detail. So I'd like to kind of pivot from questions about golf to questions about you and kind of how you think about things and view the world. You're clearly a very driven person, Jay, but what drives you?
Wow. I can't help but think, this environmental conversation, I can't help but think back a long time ago when I actually nearly went into the Peace Corps. And when I took the exam and was interviewed for the Peace Corps, I remember I took one of these personality tests early on, and what it yielded after I took the personality test, it came out like with one descriptor. And for me, it was gardener. Like I was described as a gardener, and it made me laugh because in 8th grade, I asked my parents. There was, we had a pretty big backyard. I was like, Mom, Dad, can I have that little area right there? I want to build a garden. And as an 8th grader, like, sure, kid, go ahead. And my neighbor had an amazing vegetable garden, and I was just inspired. It's like, how do we till the soil? Turn this fallow land into something beautiful that's producing fruit. Wow, this is amazing as a concept. So for me, I'm driven, maybe a little bit naturally by turning something that might be dormant or maybe a little broken or needs a little TLC and making something of it, right? And that to me, it drives me naturally. And in my career as association executive, this is my 3rd CEO gig, I guess. In each case, it was a little bit of a turnaround kind of management job. And I've really enjoyed taking something and making it better, right? So that drives me. And second is a visceral feeling in me is fairness. Is that fair? Are we being treated fairly, whether it's by the government or by market forces or whatever? And I love kind of fighting for the underdog. And golf is rarely seen as the underdog in many contexts, but in the areas of advocacy, we get treated unfairly. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the things I love, what I'm driven by, is making sure that public policy, lawsuits against golf courses or whatever, that we're treated fairly in these situations. So that drives me as well, which is one of the reasons we started an advocacy department 7 years ago, and it's flourishing. So those are the things that kind of drive me.
That's great. Well, listen, any of your members that get to listen to this episode are going to be convinced they've got not only a good guy, but a fighter representing them. And that's great. If I were a member, I'd certainly feel good after listening to you. So who has inspired you throughout your career or life, or is there someone
Yeah.
in particular now?
You know, um, I don't have necessarily these giant corporate heroes like, oh, Elon Musk is my hero, or these politicians that are my heroes. I kind of find inspiration, I think, in a lot of little places in my life. It's kind of weird to say, like, well, I don't really have a mentor. I don't have a champion but I don't know. I guess maybe because I look for the nuances and learning opportunities in a lot of places. But I'm really inspired by what I would call doers, people that just will drop what they're doing. Maybe call them sleeve rollers. The kind of, they just roll their sleeves and they'll do it. My father-in-law was like that. Just would do anything and always show up, roll up his sleeves. I don't care how dirty the job is, just doing it. I don't know if that's a lost quality as the generations are happening, but I see it seems to be a lost, quality. But just rolling up your sleeves and doing the work, right? There's pride in that. And that's just what you do. So those kinds of people, like my father-in-law, kind of inspire me on that. Change agents also. There's one association leadership example that I like to point to. His name is Roger Dow. Roger was the CEO of the U.S. Travel Association, big trade association that represents the entire travel sector. When he took over, it was a very small organization and was trying to be all things to all people in the travel sector. And he said, no, we're going to turn this into an advocacy shop. That is what we do. And that's what we're going to do. And he turned it from like a $7 million organization into a $40 million organization, like in less than 10 years, and has the industry coalesced behind him to pass major legislation and to deal with TSA and foreign governments and all of this stuff. It's just an inspiring story of taking a small association, being a change agent, and doing some really wonderful work. So those are the kind of things that come to mind.
Yeah, well, that's a great personal example and career example. I've had a chance to hear Roger Dow talk, having been in the trade show industry previously, and he's certainly an inspiring guy. In closing, Jay, what would you like to kind of leave behind? And you've got a lot more game left, so this isn't anywhere in the near term. But when you think about your legacy and what you want to leave behind for future generations, how do you think about that?
Interesting timing, John, because I recently turned 50, and that was. I'll tell you what, today, when I have to write 50 down as my age on a piece of paper, I go to the doctor's office and you're filling out the forms, it hurts. It hurts to put a 5 down first. But, maybe it's coincidental because my father-in-law recently passed away and I'm turning 50 and so these legacy questions or, mortality and legacy definitely are coming into relief more than they probably did in the past. And I haven't really thought about it a lot. Right. But I don't think much about legacy usually, except for when it comes to my kids and trying to make sure that I'm raising kids that are going to be productive and good and healthy and successful and that they have the good human qualities that you want. So that's really from a legacy standpoint, an acute issue. That's really when I think about it. But honestly, I just try to be the best that I can and hope that it serves as some example to others. And maybe it's working these days because I'm getting a lot more calls these days, almost every week from some young person who's introduced to me, referred to me. Hey, can I learn something from you? Whether it's about the golf industry association, whatever. And so I'm naturally finding myself in a much more mentor capacity. And I say yes to all those requests. Like, yes, let's have a cup of coffee. Let's talk about your career. So I'm enjoying that. It feels like a distraction some days, like, oh, I got work to do, but let me go meet with this kid. But when I sit down there and I'm talking, I'm like, man, I'm making an imprint here. And maybe I'm going to set them on a course that's going to change their lives or get them thinking about something. So that's happening more, and I'm really enjoying that, actually.
That's great. Well, happy birthday. And 50 does get you thinking. 60 will get you thinking even more.
I'm tired of thinking. I don't want to think about
it. Jay, listen, I mean, you're a good man. You're clearly a very good and capable leader. And, I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to have had you on the show here today. Thank you so much for joining me on the Golf Sustainability Podcast.
My pleasure, John. Keep doing the good work. Keep having these very important conversations. And, maybe some of these discussions will turn into a dusting off and a revitalization of the collective environmental consciousness in the golf industry. So keep it up.
Thank you, sir. I certainly hope so. And to our listeners, thanks very much for joining me on what's just been a great conversation on the Golf Sustainability Podcast. It's another example of how we try to bring industry leaders to the table to talk about this very important subject. If you've enjoyed the conversation, please recommend the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Give us a thumbs up rating on your favorite podcast player, and make sure to tune in for future episodes of the Golf Sustainability Podcast. Thanks very much and have a great day.